great cute babies together. Presumably there's an eternal significance to the marriage that we swear, these marriage vows that we swear. So what is it? And honestly, Peter, it's a little hard to see in Peter 3. But if we go to Ephesians, we see a clue in Ephesians chapter 5. And that's the passage that I have linked for you guys there. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 goes on to say, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior." And it goes on in verse 25 to say, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." That's a clue. You guys, I'm hoping that you see the parallel structures between the two, right? Like in 1 Peter 3, wives submit to your husbands. Ephesians 5, wives submit to your husbands. 1 Peter 3, husbands, be considerate and respectful towards your wives. And Ephesians 5, hey, like husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. You see the parallel. It's just in Ephesians, Paul lays out the behind-the-scenes look, like here's why this matters. Here's why. And the reason why marriage matters, the purpose for marriage, is that God likes to use images to teach his followers. Okay? God's a great teacher. Jesus is a great teacher. This is coming from a teacher, like I know. God uses imagery, analogies to get across realities that are of eternal significance. Which is why Jesus always teaches in parables. You know, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Right? The kingdom of heaven is like blank. You know, you are to be a city on the hill. Like these are all metaphors and similes that are meant to, like images that are supposed to get us in the right frame of mind and understand certain realities about how God works and how the kingdom of heaven works. You know, we're told that humans are made in God's image. Well, why is that? Because there's something about looking at each other that is supposed to remind us of a God spark. We're supposed to see God in each other. Right? If we go the opposite route and we're going to talk about how misery and suffering and all the things that's going on right now, the fear that we have with disease and coronavirus, all of this is to image something different. It's to image the ugliness and the utter devastation that sin plays on our soul. And so every ounce of suffering that Christians go through is there to remind us that this is the cost of sin. It's not punishment. The Bible never teaches that when we go through suffering that this is God punishing you for doing something wrong. That's never the case. Punishment has already been dealt out. It was dealt out not to you, but to Christ. Okay? The suffering that you're going through is there to teach. It is there to illustrate just how ugly sin is and how it destroys relationship between man and God. And so, okay, God uses images to teach. What is marriage supposed to image for us? According to Ephesians 5, marriage is made to illustrate the relationship that God has with his church. Husbands take on the role of God, and wives take on the role of the church, which is why it says, wives, submit to your own husbands as you do to God. And husbands is the head of the household, for which, just as Christ is the head of the church. Husbands, love your wives the way that Christ loved the church. You see that's the parallel that's going to set up. It's like, here's the analogy. Husbands, love your wives the way God loves the church. Now, this isn't just good marriage advice. It's also there as a teaching implement. One of the most important reasons, eternally important reasons for marriage is that it is there to teach us day in and day out about the church's relationship with God. So that in our best moments, husbands and wives are reminded of how God loves us and how Christians are to love God in return. And in our very worst moments in our marriage, the parts that we're ashamed of to bring up in small group to pray about, we're reminded of God's mercy and grace towards our fallen nature. That is, in my mind, one of the main purposes of marriage. It is there to image and remind us of God's relationship with us. So if we could hit up the next slide. So, okay, we're supposed to submit. It's for God's sake. It's here to remind us of God and our relationship. What does submit not mean? Let's start there. And this is the part where I kind of get a little nervous as I'm here talking now to the female half of the audience, and this is going to get weird for me a little bit. But here's what submission does not mean. Okay? Submission does not mean subservience. It does not mean slavery. It does not mean abuse by design. It does not mean any of those things. And here's where I point to Scripture as my basis for that, because there are men who would twist Scripture out of context and force their wives to do things that they do not want to do by pointing to passages like this. And I really want to be clear about that's not the intended purpose of this passage here. That's not Peter's intention. I just want to draw us to attention towards the bottom where it says that women are meant to be co-heirs with men in the gift of life. They're co-heirs. Women didn't inherit things back then, which is why it was so important to have sons, so that the possessions that you accumulate over a lifetime is not given to like a lazy cousin. The idea is that back then, women didn't inherit. And there's something fundamentally revolutionary in Peter's choice of words here in saying women are, even though they're to submit to their husbands, are not in any way inferior to their husbands. They are co-heirs. The other place where I draw evidence for women not being subservient to men is in Christ's own treatment of women. You look at the way that Jesus handled Mary and Martha. You look at the way that he dealt with his mother. You look at just the way he dealt with the bleeding woman. You look at the way he dealt with the girl who was dead and calling her, like, wake up, little girl. It's just the gentleness and the care and the respect and the honor to which he gives these women. I cannot believe that the gospel is there in saying, women, wives, submit to your own husbands, to mean that they're in any way, shape, or form inferior to men. That's not what this is about. If you think about the relationship, again, between husbands and wives, supposing to mirror image the relationship between Christ and the church, think about the church and the way that the church is to be submitting to God, to Christ. It is not a relationship of slavery. It is not a relationship that is coerced and forced. It is one that was chosen. It was one that was delighted in. And that is what submittal should look like. Genesis 3 did not create this concept of headship and submittal. This was built in from the get-go. This is by design. So God, in designing marriage, in designing gender, in designing men first and women second, meant there to be a natural order to things. And so Genesis 3, after sin began in the world, was not the thing that started this idea of like headship and leadership and subservience or like submittance. That didn't begin with Genesis 3. That began in Genesis 2, a whole chapter earlier. That was there from design. What Genesis 3 did, what sin did, was corrupt headship and submittance to the point where it just feels foreign to us at this point. So let's turn to slide 4, where we look at what it means for wives to submit to their husbands. Let me begin by just kind of asking you to kind of think about this. A hypothetical question. What, men included, what kind of person can you imagine yourself submitting to? Like willingly. So not your boss, because they hold power over you as a paycheck. But just think through just what kind of person would you willingly give up control over? What kind of person would you be willing to be vulnerable around? What kind of person would you be willing to kind of give up yourself to? Right? I assume that the kinds of descriptions that spring to mind when we think about this is, well, someone who's kind, right? Someone who's got good intentions for us, someone who is powerful and will take care of us and cover over our vulnerabilities, someone who's wise, who understands how things work, all of these things, right? And the idea here is that's God. What I just described is God. And it is what husbands are called to be. Now, the idea of submitting is a very uncomfortable concept in the modern society. We're in a culture where independence is highly prized, where emancipation is the norm, where we value freedom kind of above anything else. Freedom is the new religion of the secular world. And I want to just kind of tease apart what it means to be free and what it means to submit in freedom. By way of analogy, if we think about a goldfish, swimming in its little fish bowl, taking that goldfish out of the water and out of the fish bowl and putting him on dry land is not giving it freedom. The goldfish needs the boundaries and restrictions of that water to truly be free. He's not free by being out of that restriction. So there's something to the idea that we can be freer when we are in bondage to something different, when we're in bondage to something good for us, when we're under something that is meant for our good. In the same way, humans are not meant for freedom of self-rule. That is like dry land to a goldfish. The Bible promises that we are going to be servants to something. Either it's going to be God or it's going to be someone different. So when we get to this idea that wives are asked to submit to God, it's important to kind of remember that this is not because the husbands are ultimately such great, wonderful, perfect people. This is not conditional. It's not saying if your husbands are kind, if your husband is wise, if your husband is strong, if your husband is caring, then submit to him. It says submit to him. Is submit to your own husbands in the same way that you are expected to submit to world governments, in the same way that slaves were to submit to their masters. Wives, submit to your husbands. And that word, likewise, that started all of this in verse 1, that's so key, because what that tells me is that the reason why my wife should submit to me is not based on my worthiness as a husband. It's not based on my authority. It's based on God's authority. It is for God's sake that we are to submit to earthly government. It is for God's sake that slaves are to respect and submit to their masters. And it is for God's sake and God's authority, not mine. God's worth and not mine, that wives are to submit to their own husbands. What does this look like? Peter used an interesting analogy. He pointed to Sarah as an example of wives submitting to their husbands. And Sarah's an interesting choice. She's in my view, a she she do? Like for one, like when she noticed that she wasn't getting pregnant, she asked her husband to sleep with her handmaid. She didn't demonstrate faith when it was prophesied that she was going to give birth. And so just in a lot of ways, like Sarah's a weird choice. And even for Sarah, like like Sarah's flawed, but she has like examples of submitting to her husband. There's an Old Testament story in Genesis. It's not well known, but there was a point where Abraham was traveling with his family. And they were passing through this country, and the king of that country, Abimelech, thought Sarah looked hot. And Abraham, if he had faith that God was going to take care of him, he was going to keep his promise and see him blessed and take care of him, he would have just, in courage and in faith, just stood up to the king, Abimelech. Instead, what he did was he went to his wife and said, hey, this king thinks you're hot. If he knows that you're married to me, if we're married, he might just kill me and take you for his wife. I don't want to die, babe, so I'm going to need you to pretend to be my sister, and whatever the king wants, we'll just have that happen. That's just what we need to do. I need you to trust me on this. Just trust me on this. That was a terrible idea. Just terrible idea. Just like fail in like husband class, right? They're like, you don't do that. You don't do that. That's a terrible idea. And you know what Sarah did? She did it. Not one recorded instance of complaint, not one recorded instance of grudging her husband this, just went along with it. To the point where he literally ended up in that king's bedchambers, and it took God stopping that king for nothing bad to happen. Like God stepped in and fixed Abraham's mistake. That's submission to like that's such a great example of submission. Why not use that example, Peter? You know what example Peter used for Sarah as an example of submission? She called him Lord. Peter, that's your example? Like, come on. That whole thing with Abimelech, like that's submission right there. Like, no. She called him Lord. Now, there's one place in Genesis where Sarah calls her husband Lord. One place where I'm sure she did it a lot more, but one place where it was recorded that she called him Lord. It's in Genesis 18. And if you want or feel like it, and in the privacy of your own home, you can Google Genesis 18 with me real quickly, and you can find it pretty quick. And the setup is that they're, at this point, old, and God's been promising for years that you're going to have a kid, and the kid's going to become like a massive nation, and you're going to have many sons, and and they're well into their hundreds, and they're childless. And God comes in the form of 3 men to visit Abraham, and essentially tells them that your wife is going to be pregnant next year, like you're going to give birth. Congratulations. And here's the startling thing. In verse, what verse is it? Actually, let me find it real quick. This is amazing, guys. Come with me here. So in Genesis 18 again, and we're down to verse 12. So Sarah, kind of overheard this conversation in the next tent. And in the privacy of her own tent, Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? That's it, that right there. My Lord, not even like, oh, my Lord, let me serve you, my Lord. It's like, I'm old, my Lord is old, I'm old. Like, just kind of this offhand comment calling her husband my Lord. That's the only place in the Old Testament where Sarah is recorded as calling Abraham Lord. Why use that example? That's weird. And I loved how some commentaries kind of called this out. Yes, this whole thing with Abimelech is a great example of public submission. But notice that what Sarah did in saying, calling her husband Lord, this was in the privacy of her own tent. This is in the privacy of her own thoughts. This wasn't even spoken out loud. This is just what she was thinking. And I think there's something very telling about what we think in our private moments when our guards are dropped down. And in Sarah's mind, the regard she has for her dummy husband was so high that even when he's not around and there's no one around to overhear and potentially tell him, like in the privacy of her own mind, she had such high regard for her husband. That she would call him Lord. I think that's a piece of what it means to submit. I think that's why Peter chose that example. So wives, if you're near your husbands, take a look at him. What do you think of him? For all his wonderful nature and all the ways that he is so good to you and to the family and all the ways that he has failed you and your family, like, do you respect him? Do you honor him in just the privacy of your own minds? How do you think of your husband? Because you have some measure of control over that. You know, like things come up and people get angry, but you have control over how you choose to view the man who is next to you. And I think there's a measure of submit that goes down to the thoughts and not just the actions. I think submit also means, just kind of continue on here past this, submit I think also has a dimension of alluding to the fact that there are different roles that men and women are meant to play. I think it assumes that men is supposed to have headship. We'll get to the men in a moment. But I think it also kind of gets at, it implies that woman has a role as a helper. And again, this goes back to Genesis 2, where Eve was created second to be helper to Adam. I just want to take a moment and just really thank my wife Natalie as well. I come up here and I preach once in a while and generally do an okay job at it. And I think so much of it comes down to the support and this help that my wife has provided me, and not just being a thought partner in a lot of these and kind of proofreading the ideas and giving me feedback and criticisms and kind of debating these ideas with me before I come on stage and preach, but also just in the nuts and bolts of taking care of Chloe for an entire Saturday or more so that I have the time to kind of like be able to think and pray and prepare. And just so much of what I do on stage is a result of the help that my wife provides me. And I think that's just another great example of what submitting potentially looks like as well. Let's hit up slide 5. Ooh, okay, I need to pick things up a bit. Inner beauty. So Peter is saying, like, okay, here's what Peter's not saying. Peter's not against outer beauty. I don't think Peter's against the idea of taking care of yourself and looking nice. But I think here's where he's getting at. When people think about you, women, when people think about you, what are some of the descriptions that come to mind first? You know, is it your appearance? Is it what do you want people to think about you when they're trying to describe you? Like, what kinds of adjectives are coming to mind? Is it things that are external? Is it things that are superficial, right? We're just got out of, as a teacher and like a counselor at a high school, I just got out of like college application phase, and I was like writing letter of rec after letter of recommendations. Letter of recommendations The way you oftentimes start preparing to write these is you sit down and you literally think about the student. And you list out, like, what are some words that come to mind as I think about this kid. And like, it's very telling if the main things that come to mind are things like, is in class, is on the baseball team. And that's really, like, as much as I can dig, that seems to be all I can come up with. Versus, like, the strongest letter is always like very kind, eager to help others, participates well, strong leadership abilities. Like these characteristics that are really just like on the inside and permeates everything that they do, so much so that those are the words that spring to mind when you think about them. That, by way of analogy, I think is how Peter is presenting this. It's not that high school students are not supposed to participate on the basketball team or should not, do baseball or all these other surface level things, but it's that what is at the core of their identity? Is it just those things? Or is it like who they are that really drives their participation in these activities? And in the same way, women, nothing wrong with looking nice. Nothing wrong with a little makeup, a little, take your time, look good. Nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, what do you want people to think of when they're trying to describe you? This is where the passage that you're seeing right now, chapter 3, verse 3 through 4, that's on the slide at the moment. Usually when we preach, we use the NIV version. This I had to pull from the ESV because I think the ESV version just does a much better job describing this. Let me read. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart. I love that. Hidden person of the heart. You know what that says? You're a person. You are a person and not a body. You are a person, women, wives. You are a person that is to be honored and respected, not a body to be decorated. That's what that says to me right there. It's so easy to look at this passage and just see like, do not, do not, do not, and think of this like, wait, this is just Peter obviously restricting women's rights, and he's trying to limit them and restrict women, when this is really meant to be a passage that frees them and show them what true confidence really means. Because there's many types of things that women can point to give them confidence. There's a type of confidence that models have when they walk down the runway and they do the little hip sway thing. That's the epitome of what society points to. That's a confident woman right there. Ask any of them about their weight and how they feel about it. Ask any of them about their figure and like how fearful they are about losing it, about eating and not like losing potentially their positions. That's not confidence. Beauty is not confidence. There's a confidence that women can have in climbing career ladders and making money and proving that they can kick it with the boys. And people point to successful businesswomen and socialites and presidential candidates and say, look, there is a confident woman right there. But those things all fade too. You're eventually going to retire if you live that long. And when you retire, where is the confidence then? There's a confidence that you can get from putting down other women. There's a confidence some women draw from dominating men in their lives. There's just like all these things that, I mean, don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with pursuing a career or having physical beauty. But again, these are all things that fade, and they're not to be your source of eternal confidence. What it should be is what Peter says. Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Gentle and quiet spirit. Your confidence should look like that. Gentle and quiet spirit. Someone who is kind, who has No need to boast or brag, because she knows that her worth, your worth, women, wives, your worth is not to be found in your marriage. Your worth is not to be found in your jobs. It's not to be found in your accomplishments or your kids' or your husband's accomplishments. It was, is, and always should be found in the fact that you, women, wives, you was someone that the creator of the universe found worthy enough to die for. That's where your confidence should spring from. And as a side note, men, the same goes for you as well. This is how we can, let's head to next slide, slide 6. This is why he goes on to say that, like, you should not have fear. If you are like Sarah, you are someone who do what is right and do not give way to fear. You're not supposed to have fear in your life. Think about the fear and the worry that women have in losing their beauty. Why are women so obsessed with beauty? Underpinning so much of that is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing someone, fear of someone losing interest in you. There's a confidence that comes from knowing Christ and hoping in God that does not rely on things that fade, like beauty or careers, or rejections and loss. Proverbs 31 describes a woman who is godly, who cares for and provides for her family, who laughs at the future because she knows that she is secure. She knows that she's done what she needs to, and the rest she can trust to God and her husband to handle. It describes a woman who is kind, a woman who is gentle, a woman who manages her household well. This is not a passage meant to restrict women. It is meant to give women the most solid basis for confidence there is, and remind them that they are there to be image bearers of the church and the Christ and the relationship that there is. The church is not there to be confident in themselves and their own accomplishment. The church is there to be confident because Christ died for them. And in the same way, let your own sense of confidence remind you of that fact day in and day out. And remind your husband of that fact day in and day out. And remind your children of that fact day in and day out, that your source of confidence lies with God. That's where it's always belonged. Let's get to the boys. Verse 7. Slide 7, sorry. Live with your wives in understanding is the title. This here again is another place where I think the ESV version just does a much better job than NIV. In the NIV version, it says, husbands, be considerate of your wives. And nothing wrong with that. We should be considerate. But I think ESV took the word considerate and broke it down for us a little bit better, I think. And it goes on to say this. Likewise, I take that to mean for God's sake. In the same way wives are to submit to their husbands for God's sake, likewise, husbands, do this next thing for God's sake. Okay. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. In an understanding way. You know what it takes to, husbands, you know what it takes to live with your wives in an understanding way? You have to understand your woman. And that takes time. And that takes energy, that takes patience, that takes all of these things. It takes surrendering, right? There's this thing that when Natalie and I first got married, where I have this tendency to kind of like say the phrase, like, I'm always right. That's a phrase that like it keeps coming up all the time. And at first I say it jokingly. And so like anytime it's like, oh, should we go here or should we go there? And I was like, we should go there. And it's like, lo and behold, like I was correct. It's like, I'm always right. I say it jokingly. But it's surprising how much of that really permeated into my identity and the way of thinking. I think men, in taking on headship, in taking on leadership, take it to mean that like we need to always be right, because if we are wrong, we're failing family somehow. Like there's a part of it that, I mean, if I spin this in a noble way, like we're almost preconditioned to want to always be right. But we're not. We're not. We're not Christ. We're images of him, but we're imperfect images of Christ. We are not God. Right? And sometimes it takes failure to remind us of that. And here's the thing, even if you are right, and there are times when Nat and I argue where like, I'm right, who cares? Even if I win that argument, like I still lose her. It's a lose-lose situation if you hold on to this like idea that you need to always be right. It's a losing battle. In Ephesians, what we read earlier, Ephesians also takes it a step further and says, like husbands, you are to love your wives the way Christ loves the church, in that he died for her. In my mind, at least, this seems, honestly, like we look at the passage in Peter 3 and we think, wow, wives have it bad. They have to submit to the husbands. Dude, guys, we need to die for our wives. That, in my mind, always felt like the harder part of the battle, right? And honestly, like for those of you guys who know me for a really long time, I had a fear of marriage for precisely this passage, this exact reason. Because I looked at it and said, yes, wives submit to husbands, but guess what? Husbands, you need to die for your wives. I was like, no, thank you. And it's like that goldfish example I brought up earlier, right? I thought that living the freedom of dry land is what I as a goldfish needed and wanted, but really, it's not. There is freedom to be found in boundaries and restrictions, right? And there is freedom to be found in sacrificing yourself for your wife. So here's what I think this means for husbands. Dying for your wives means that you don't always have to be right, even sometimes when you totally are. It means going with her opinions rather than insisting on your preferences. It means being the first to swallow your pride and anger and apologize. It means to provide for your family and sacrificing as much as you need to see that happens. This is hard to say, but Natalie is definitely the breadwinner in the family, and that she makes a lot more than I do. And I have told her this before, and I would say it to her again, like if she decides at some point that she does not want to work anymore and that she wants to spend time at home, it's my job and my responsibility to see that happens and do what I need to make that work. We may have to change our living situations drastically, but that's my lot as a husband, is to see that happens and that works out. The dying for your wife means that you save the husband card, the submit to me wife card, for things that actually matter. So it's not like, oh, where do we go on family vacation? Like, bam, husband card, submit to me. Like, no. You play that card when it really matters. On everything else, die for your wife. Die for your wife. Because guess what? I asked earlier, again, what kind of person would you be willing to submit to? What kind of person would you be willing to be vulnerable around? If a wife knows that the husband is willing to sacrifice, is willing to give up, is willing to surrender things her way, the stuff that he demands is the important things. Right? It's the stuff of eternal significance. That kind of stuff, for a wife, I would hope that in moments like that, when push comes to shove and your husband is finally showing that husband card and say, I need you to trust me on this, babe. I believe and I prayed and I know that God is leading us down this path, and I need you to trust me on this. And in those moments, wives, submit to your husbands. Last slide, and I promise we're almost done. I think we're running a little over time. Apologies. Final note to the husbands on slide 8. So it concludes, I guess, that we are to, again, live with your wives in an understanding way. And then it kind of ends, verse 7 ends with this idea that nothing will then hinder your prayers. And it's easy to read that and think that, okay, this passage is basically saying, husbands, you need to pray for your family more. And no, that's not what it says. It's not saying, husbands, pray for your family more. It's saying that if you don't take care of your family, you're probably not going to be praying at all. Or if you pray, it's not going to be effective. It's going to be hindered. That's what that says. The idea here is that prayer doesn't make us live right, but right living makes us pray. And so why is that, right? Well, I think there's many components to this, but if a husband does his job well as a husband, he recognizes his own weaknesses and the weaknesses of his wife, and is able to come to God in prayer over that. He realizes that he's helpless in the face of a lot of these family struggles or fights or arguments or problems that crop up, and that so much of this is beyond his control. Like, he's realistic about that. He's not a control freak. He's willing to surrender the control of these things over to God in prayer. He's able to have a correct orientation of his wife's value and worth as a co-heir. Like, he's not there lording it over her and have this pride and arrogance in the back of his mind that I am always right. No. She is equally valuable to you, to God as you are. And that correct orientation can only help you in humility to pray better. You see your wife as a fellow image bearer of God and is worthy of respect and honor and consideration. And I just end here with this quote by Wayne Grudem that says that God is so concerned that Christian husbands should live in an understanding and loving way with their wives that God is willing to interrupt his relationship with husbands when they're not doing so. My prayer for everyone and challenge going forward is that we truly see that there is a purpose to marriage, that it's not just there because of circumstance or our own choices, but that we are placed in these relationships to act as image bearers to God and to be a living example of what Christ and the church's relationship should look like. And so would we love the way that we're meant to? Would we love the way Christ does? Would we give up of ourselves the way Christ does? Would we submit the way Christ does? And in doing so, just image God and give him glory in all that we do. Amen.